about 5 truly extraordinary leaders from the political class. And they are really a pantheon of remarkable human beings. The first is George Washington. By the way, the problem with George Washington is he's an icon. No one should ever want to achieve icon status because it means you're unknowable. But we need to, and I'll mention it in a moment, we need to understand one of George Washington's greatest gifts. And I think it's probably one that not a single person in this room would associate with great leadership. The second is another president, Abraham Lincoln. Washington is the founder, but Lincoln is the unifier. And I want to mention something about Abraham Lincoln's leadership that people in this room probably would not associate with leadership either. The third is Winston Spencer Churchill, easily the greatest prime minister in the history of Great Britain. Again, you would never associate something I'm going to mention about Churchill with great leadership. The next is Martin Luther King Jr. I keep a portrait of all of these people in my office on Capitol Hill. The more we know about King, the greater he becomes. And the last one is Ronald Reagan. A remarkably a gifted leader. Washington. May I tell you, I've spent a lifetime reading about the man who, other than Tim, is the truly indispensable man of American history. In fact, the most famous biography ever written of George Washington is called The Indispensable Man by Thomas Flexner. And I remember reading, this is a 5-volume study of George Washington. By the way, very few people are worthy of even 1 volume. Washington is so great that 5 volumes doesn't cover it. But it's in volume 3 that I literally had to stop reading, and kind of like Garfield does the think bubble, I had to go back to the beginning of those 2 chapters and read them again. George Washington, don't take my word on any of this, go check. George Washington is the greatest retreater in the history of the American military. Now, I thought that leadership was supposed to be that you live out on the rim of the world. And you go from treetop to treetop to treetop as you scale ever higher and higher and higher. Washington, who, by the way, as you all know, was our first great general. He was the president of the Constitutional Convention by unanimous acclamation. And he was president of the United States, our first, and he was reelected, would have been elected the 3rd time, unanimously each time. People as disparate as Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, I mean the pantheon of our founders, independently, diaries, letters, etc., all concluded, and these are great men, they all concluded that Washington was the greatest man they'd ever met. John Adams goes to meet King George III, right? The bitterest enemy America has ever had. The first question that Adams is asked by King George III is, tell me about Washington. Because if it's true about Washington, which is that Washington voluntarily stepped out of power, he said, if it's true of Washington, he's the greatest man in the world. But Flexner makes very clear that George Washington retreated far more than he advanced. He retreated by a number of more than 2 to 1. Did you know that? More than 2 to 1. He knew when to go backwards. I promise you, without dwelling on Washington, that that is one of the greatest lessons of George Washington's life. He was really good at understanding when he could go no further, including at the absolute apogee of his popularity. May I tell you, by the beginning of his second term, there was a move afoot in America to make him a king. This is how popular Washington had become so rapidly. Remember that Washington is really good at self-selecting himself out of the inner ring. Abraham Lincoln. May I tell you, if we had 10 hours, and I know it's dangerous between a speaker and dinner, so praise God we don't. Lincoln, like Washington, had a very unfortunate relationship with his father. It was so bad that Lincoln did not go to his own father's funeral. He often said of his father, the one thing I learned from my dad was that no man should ever be forced to work and not be paid for it, which was really the seedbed of Lincoln's eventual abolitionism. May I tell you the thing about Lincoln that will, I think, perhaps most surprise you? Lincoln had an ambition that was so burning that if he had not habituated himself to personal virtue, he may have been the most dangerous president we had ever had. I went to lunch 2 years ago in Gettysburg with the most highly regarded living Lincoln scholar, Allen Guelzo. I'm a great fan of Lincoln's, and I said to Allen, at what age did Lincoln seriously know that he could be the President of the United States? And I thought it was probably somewhere around 1857, 58. Without batting an eyelash, Allen said when he was 5 years old. And I laughed like the Cheshire Cat, and I said, no, he said, yeah, really, 5 years old. What do you mean, I said? There is a remarkable diary entry. Lincoln had no personal friends. He really didn't. But he had a law partner who was his lifelong law partner and probably the closest thing that he had to a good friend. And this man's last name was Herndon. And after the president was murdered before his 60th birthday, on the principle that all of us are created equal, Herndon found himself, if you can believe this, at a dinner party with Lincoln's stepmother, whom Lincoln said was most responsible for every achievement he ever had in life. And Herndon finds himself at dinner with Abraham Lincoln's mother and says to Mrs. Lincoln, what was the seedbed of this man's greatness? She was a remarkably illiterate woman. There is a very famous photograph that exists of her. And she says to Herndon the following. She's speaking of Abraham Lincoln. She says, you know, from the youngest of ages, this is a boy who knew how to listen to other people. It's a remarkable insight. I don't know about you, but I think I can count on one hand the number of contemporary presidents whose calling card is not speaking, but listening. Lincoln was the deepest listener that we've ever had in the White House. Churchill. May I tell you, we have all of what we would all call elementary school. We have all the records of Churchill. He was the world's worst student. He couldn't add 2 and 2. I mean, this was a boy who several of his masters at Harrow said they used the word, Churchill is dumb, really dumb. Can you imagine? He finds himself in the equivalent of 11th grade, and every boy in that room is assigned one country that they have to become an expert in. And they drew the names out of a hat. Churchill believed in providence. Wasn't a Christian, but he believed in providence. Can you believe he picked out of that hat the country of Germany? And for 1 calendar year at Harrow, he became an expert in the history of the Teutonic people. He later told several of his associates that it's probable that the one thing that the greatest war leader probably in the last, 500 years, that the one thing that most of the people probably did not know about Churchill was while he had a problem adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing, that Providence had prepared him in a way to know the culture of Hitler better perhaps than Hitler knew it himself. Martin Luther King Jr. May I tell you all, this was an extraordinary man by any objective measure. And I mean by any objective measure. This is a man who was one of the most gifted orators of the last 200 years, a man who would have been a very fine president. When I was going through all of my turmoil and problem, a friend of mine who knew that I was a great fan of Dr. King called me on the phone. He said, do you and I both agree that Martin Luther King is one of the absolute pantheon of Americans? Did you know that he was a plagiarist? I said, pardon me? And when I say I almost fell out of my stool or bench, I mean, what? Absolutely right. Dr. King was a confirmed plagiarist. And we know from 2 of his closest associates that it was admitted, it was confessed, and King grew from that. And King shows us in this example that it's not where you begin, it's where you end. Eliot has the great line, "In my end is my beginning." It's a profoundly Christian statement. In one sense, it's true this side of eternity as well. Lastly, Ronald Reagan. Reagan was called an amiable dunce by one of his greatest detractors. And there was a woman who had grown up with Ronald Reagan who had talked about his unthinking heroism. And in light of this terrible comment that had been made about Ronald Reagan, this woman who had grown up with Ronald Reagan in the same town of Eureka, Illinois, felt she had to find some way to illustrate and show in Ronald Reagan's own person that he had shown personal, unthinking bravery and regard for human life, that he wasn't an amiable dunce, that this kind of moral courage and integrity was a central part of leadership Not just physical courage, but moral courage, which begins in that view that every human being is metaphysically equal and of inestimable value just because he or she exists. And she wrote this column in one of the smallest newspapers in Illinois. And she said, if I recall right, Ronald Reagan was a lifeguard and unthinkingly pulled 22 people out of the Rock River from drowning. And the man who had made the amiable dunce comment played on this and thought, this is the craziest defense I've ever heard. Leave it to an amiable dunce to put a former childhood friend up to telling this kind of a lie. If Ronald Reagan unthinkingly pulled even one person from the Rock River, it would be an extraordinary thing. Well, it turns out that, believe it or not, the county that Eureka is in Illinois keeps records. And it turns out this woman's mother was the record keeper. And the man who made the charge about the amiable dunce was right. Ronald Reagan had not unthinkingly, unselfishly pulled one man from the Rock River. He had pulled 22. The one thing, this is a big statement, the one thing that great political leaders have in common, other than the virtue, humility, and character which I mentioned earlier, those are central. Those are immutable, unchanging, unwavering. The one thing that men and women, and I could name a number of women, that people like Washington and Lincoln and Churchill and King and Reagan, the one thing they have in common is they find a way to shape the future by the present. They somehow see things in the vision and mission that they have for this country or for their own countries or for the world that those who are living at the same time simply don't see and actually believe are impossible. George Washington believed deeply and firmly that the United States of America would be the leader for freedom in the world within 100 years of its founding. Don't take my word for it. If you read history, you will find categorically that even though he made these statements rather routinely, the most eminent men and women of his time fundamentally disagreed with Washington about this. It took less than 100 years. Abraham Lincoln. He says in the Cooper Union speech, remember, that's the speech that makes Lincoln president. He says, if slavery is wrong in Kansas and Nebraska, then it's wrong everywhere. You mean you can't make a states' rights case for slavery? Lincoln says the following of slavery. Are you ready? These are fighting words in the late 1850s in America. He says, no. He says slavery is wrong. Why is that? Lincoln says it's not just bad policy, it's unjust. As I say, he was murdered on a principle, but the slaves were freed. Overwhelmingly, all the worthies in both political parties on the day of Lincoln's election would have said that anybody who thinks that all the slaves will be free is a crazy man. Martin Luther King Jr. May I tell you all, if you read nothing else in your entire life, I'm pleading with you to read one document. Letter from a Birmingham jail. You remember when they came into Anne Frank's house, they thought they could just burn it all. And so they took that little box that was containing the diary, they pitched it in the garbage because they didn't even think it was worth burning. Dr. King, of course, preferred Kleenex or toilet tissue to write his letters on if he couldn't get regular foolscap or writing paper. Read Letter from a Birmingham Jail and you will hear every echo of Abraham Lincoln. It is not a coincidence that Dr. King's greatest speech is given in front of the Lincoln Memorial as a 20th century echo of what constitutes justice as the very purpose of government. And finally, Ronald Reagan. By the way, that was Providence. Finally, Ronald Reagan had a very eminent foreign policy scholar come to his home in Bel Air, a Tony suburb of Los Angeles. Are you ready for this? In 1968, he spent 8 contiguous hours with Ronald Reagan about the way that the United States needed to work to contain and to find a partnership with the Soviet Union, the leader for communism in the world. And after 8 hours, this is 1968, this man says to Governor Reagan, "What do you think, Ronnie?" And Ronald Reagan says, "How about this? How about we win and they lose? How about that as a policy?" This man writes at length about this meeting. He says, "I laughed in Ronald Reagan's face. I explained to him that the wall would never come down, that Soviet communism was implacable. But of course, a version or a section of the Berlin Wall sits right outside the Ronald Reagan Library today. And Soviet communism fell. It is about virtue, it is about character, it is about humility, and it is about a code of honor and a series of principles that you hold regardless of what the political class, regardless of what the culture tells you. Those are your principles, and they form the bedrock of the things that you believe, which are unwavering. So at the expense in keeping my promise of being Solomonic, I'm going to happily stop there and answer or duck a few questions.